Hello, everybody. As I often say, now for something completely different, address from your BC Green leader. There's a few things that are different about me from the other two. Some you might not notice. One, I'm the only elected leader here. I'm also the only returning leader. And third, and maybe most important, I'm the only leader in full-blown menopause right now. So. I'm delighted to be here on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. They've been stewarding these lands for a very long time and seem to be showing an enormous amount of leadership right now. And I've been listening. I have a speech. I'm not going to read it because I always fail to read my speeches. But I've been listening to the other two leaders. And I think about politics, and I think about business, and I think about the stories we tell. And we're hearing stories from political leaders right now that feel to me a little outdated. Stories about us being a small export-dependent economy. Stories about mining, forestry, gas, about exploiting our natural resources and getting them out to the rest of the world. And I think about business leaders, and I imagine all of you think about looking backwards to figure out how you're going to make your businesses work. In fact, business leaders who are successful are looking at the horizon and imagining what's possible. Looking at the horizon and not saying, let's just keep doing things the way everybody else is doing it, but let's start offering something different. Let's imagine something different. And I think in BC, we have been trapped in some pretty old stories in this province, and those stories aren't serving us very well. When I looked at the budget this year when it came out, I wanted to see how much of provincial revenue came from all these natural resources that we talk about so often. Oil and gas, mining, forestry, all in, all combined, 3.86% of revenues to government. 3.86%. The big revenues to government are coming from services, from housing, and there's some challenges there. But let's be honest about what's fueling our economy. I also think about the stories we tell about oil and gas in particular, and the LNG industry in this province. And I ask myself, why is it that this industry that we think is so important needs over $5 billion of government support just to make a business case to be operating here? Because if we put that money into industries that are actually driving our economy, 9,000 tech workers in Victoria alone, 9,000 tech workers in Victoria, that's a knowledge economy. That's a big difference between the less than 1,000 permanent employees that are going to be at LNG Canada Phase 1. Which is pulling us backwards in our energy. It's pulling us backwards in the vision that we could have for this province. It's pulling us backwards to a place where we tie our energy costs to the global market, instead of ensuring that we're creating the most abundant, clean energy to drive the businesses here that should be building things, that should be focused on innovation and technology, that should be centering BC, not as the country or the province that is waiting to stay in the 20th century a little bit longer, but as the province that's looking at the horizon and saying we could be the global leaders. We could rid ourselves of this dependence on a fossil fuel economy, lean into the abundant clean energy that we have available to us here, and be like California and Texas, where there's negative billing on energy bills because they have so much abundant solar energy right now. We're falling behind because we're telling the wrong stories. We're falling behind because our politicians, well, are staying in a century that we need to let go of now. They're staying in a century where we can somehow square the circle of building more fossil fuel infrastructure and at the same time claiming that we're climate leaders. Building more fossil fuel infrastructure when the International Energy Agency over and over and over again is telling us the demand for gas is going to peak by the end of this decade. And by the way, we can't compete with Qatar, which can produce LNG for 6 cents per million British thermal units compared to our $6 to $10. That's why we have to prop it up with government money. These stories don't make any sense to me anymore. And so the story that we have is a story of government doing its job and measuring that job properly. The job of government is to ensure that there is thriving, healthy people that can participate in the economy, highly skilled, highly trained people who can afford to go to university and afford to go to those trades training programs, who can afford to live here. That's the job of government, to make sure that people have access to healthcare, and that healthcare doesn't become the next financialized industry the way housing has become, that leaves too many people behind, because it's far more cost-effective to keep healthcare public and to ensure that it is seen as a human right, just like housing is a human right. It's far more cost-effective to approach that way as government. I've been hearing so much in the last days and weeks about crime and public safety, and I have not yet once heard the word inequality. I studied history. One of the things that is the most damaging to the fabric of society is growing inequality. I just looked it up. The average income in BC right now is $53,000. The median income is $44,000. Half of people in BC earn less than $44,000. I want you to contemplate what it would be like to live on less than $44,000 right now. And I want you to ask yourselves, what impact is that inequality having on your success, on your businesses, on there being people that can afford to spend money, that can afford to take risks, that can afford to invest in more education so you get those highly skilled and highly trained people? If you're making less than $44,000 right now, you're barely holding on. And that's half our province. We have an inequality problem in this province, and it's emerging in our communities, in our downtowns, in our growing homelessness crisis. And it's far more expensive to let that crisis go unabated. It's very interesting to me, I'm not hearing from the other leaders, an urgent drive to solve homelessness, because we know where the jurisdictions that do solve homelessness spend a lot less money than the cost it is to just leave people unhoused. Poverty is a huge draw on our economy, on our society, on our social fabric. We lose our compassion, we start dehumanizing people, and we have to admit, we have to recognize that the role of government is to ensure that these kinds of conditions are not happening in our province. We have the resources, we have the wealth, we have the capacity. We are lacking the political urgency and the political will to say, if we're spending $89 billion a year, we're going to solve all the problems. We're almost on par. I'm going very fast right now because I don't know how much time I have left. But I'm wearing my secondhand Danish suit, which I really love. The reason I'm talking about Denmark, we are almost on par per capita with what Denmark as a country spends in its budget. Now let's think about what Denmark has. All the nice things, including great suits, secondhand by the way. You get paid to go to university in Denmark. You can be assured of childcare. You can be assured of healthcare. You get fantastic parental leave. So if we're spending almost as much as Denmark, I want all the nice things. It makes no sense to me how we're spending this much and not solving problems. And so what we need are people in government that aren't looking at the past, that aren't staring at the 20th century and saying, how do we get back there? Who aren't ignoring the unbelievable impact of climate change to our economy, to our health, to our future, to the well-being and mental health of our young people. We need leaders who can look at the horizon the way business leaders look at the horizon and say, I can imagine something so much better than this. I can imagine us having all the nice things. It's possible to do that. And if government does its job and measures its work properly, we can get there. That's the vision I have for BC. That's the vision the BC Greens have put into our platform that we released yesterday. And that's the vision that I think could move us to a very different place in this problem, where we aren't falling behind. When I hear David Eby say we got 9,000 megawatts of clean energy in the last call for clean energy, I think, how far behind are we on clean energy? Because we stalled out in 2017 by approving an incredibly expensive and who knows how effective project, Site C, for which the energy is meant to go to the LNG industry, another little gift to them, because apparently their multi-billion-dollar oil and gas industry needs government welfare checks. How far behind are we on creating that province where we have so much abundant clean energy, so much affordable clean energy, that businesses are thinking, wow, I could do almost anything. I can envision a future like what quantum technologies is doing in Squamish right now. Let's invent, create, sell, and export the technology to recapture helium. Like, we're doing that in BC. That's the kind of economy we should be striving for, not the economy that says we're going to dig things out of the ground, we're going to cut things up, and we're going to ship them off as quickly as we can. It's a primary economy. Let's move into a tertiary economy, be the knowledge-based economy that BC has the possibility of being, and stop dreaming so small. Bit feisty.
Thank you, Sonia. People are already getting their questions into Slido. Let's start with some of the survey results. Large majority of our members calling for a bold economic vision. You released your platform yesterday. Some of the pieces in it: an increase in the carbon tax, a new 2% tax on homes over $3 million. There's a bunch of other pieces in there.
From 0.2 to 2.4%.
Sorry, thank you.
But
all of this...
I just really want to clarify, it's not a doubling of property taxes, which may have been put out accidentally in some headlines. It's a 0.2% increase on the school tax of houses over $3 million. That's what we've put in our platform.
But the point I would like to make is that your platform is funded by $9 billion of increases in corporate, personal, income, property, and carbon taxes, when we already have a $9 billion deficit. Mm-hmm. So how, if you were to form government, would you pay for for these kinds of, like, how would you actually kind of rectify this revenue?
Yeah, well, one of the problems that we have to solve is that we are not effectively, as governments around the world, we're not effectively taxing wealth. How do I know that? The billionaires now have a combination of over $14 trillion in wealth. They have so much wealth, they're shooting themselves up in the sky, they're sending themselves to the bottom of the ocean in submarines. They don't know what to do with it all. So governments can help with that. Governments can say, hey, if you're making that much profit, and it's harming people in our communities because they are facing these affordability costs, let's connect the dots here. And governments can help out by saying we're gonna just take a little bit of that profit back, or if you have enough wealth that you have a $3 or $7 or $14 million house, we're gonna just say, okay, a little bit of that can come back. And we start to invest that money much more wisely than we have into shaping the future that we want. And how do we do it more wisely? We measure the outcomes in terms of well-being. This is not made up. This is happening in Scotland, in Iceland, in Germany, in New Zealand. There are countries around the world that are recognizing that after 40 years of governments saying, hey, let's unleash the free market or unleash the private sector, as I hear from John, they're realizing, when we look at financialized housing, when we look at the costs of allowing unfettered profits, and the impact that's having on our social fabric, the impact that's having on growing inequality, it's the job of governments to put a ceiling and a floor.
Recognizing what you're saying about the wealthy, I mean, our survey results, though, showed 81% said government is not doing enough to address affordability. So that is being felt widespread. Yeah. And some of what you're talking about, the increases in your platform, would impact that group of people.
Yeah, like I said, if we're looking at the median income, $44,000, I think we have to spend some time and attention on the half of British Columbians who are existing on less than $45,000 a year. And we have to make sure that that growth in poverty and the depth of poverty that we're seeing, that undermines the fabric of our society. And so there is a necessity in a time like this, after we've seen this absolute growth in inequality, especially in the last 4 years. Like I looked at the billionaires' combined assets a couple months ago, and it was at 12.4 trillion. 12.4 trillion, 12.4 thousand billion dollars. And now it's at 14.2, 2 months later. The problem is once the wealth starts to accumulate to that extent in fewer and fewer hands, it becomes like a giant magnet. And government's job is to make sure that there are some of those filings that all don't go up to the very top. And it's to recognize, if we want an economy that's functioning and working, the more people that can participate in the economy, the better.
Speaking of a functioning economy, many would say in the business community that a big important part of that is around natural resources. And your platform said, and the production, distribution, and export of natural gas. 52% in our survey would like to see more natural resource development. How do you address those 52%?
I think if we're, I was thinking about the 17 mines. Okay, if we're gonna bring 17 mines within a regulatory framework that protects the environment. We've had the largest mining disaster in Canada. So we have some holes in how we have done. There was a Auditor General report in 2015 about the failures of oversight and compliance in the mining sector. So let's make sure that when we are doing resource extraction, that we are ensuring that the well-being of people, communities, and the environment are part of that. But can't we imagine that those minerals aren't just going to some other country where they're building this technology, where they're using our raw resources to create the secondary manufacturing and the innovation of the economy that we want? Shouldn't we be excited about thinking, well, if we're extracting these minerals and these resources here, why aren't we adding the jobs and the value and the benefits to our GDP and our businesses by being not just a primary economy, but a secondary economy, a tertiary economy? And I think, when I hear this idea that we're just going to keep sending out our raw resources, that hasn't been great. The vice president of West Fraser Timber, just a month ago, was at a conference on forestry, and he said basically there's nothing left to log in BC. We've logged all the forests. The only thing that's left is primary, and that's 150 years of government not looking at the horizon and saying, how are we using these resources not just to create wealth for the companies that are exporting it, but to make sure that that wealth benefits the communities, that it's staying here, that it's value added, that we're actually building and creating something more than raw resources.
Significant challenges in the forestry industry aside, it might feel a little deja vu to you if you think about where you were in 2017.
Yeah.
Because once again, at the end of this election campaign, you could find yourself holding the balance of power.
Yes.
And so with that in mind, what would be your strategy? What are some of those priorities and some of the deal breakers?
I've probably got John's and Dave's attention right now. Mm-hmm. I really hope we come out of this election without a majority. I think we see what happens in BC. We just have to look historically. We've typically had two parties. The names change sometimes, but it's been typically a two-party system in BC. And what happens is one party gets in for a while, and they make all these promises and give all these tax cuts, and we see cuts to services, or we see growth to the public service, and all these kind of patterns and trends. And then people get weary of that, and they toss them out, and then they elect in the other side, and they undo a whole bunch of things, and then they make promises, and they do their thing. And then after a while, the population gets tired of that, tosses them out. And we've been in this rinse and repeat cycle. So if you want to talk about, predictability and certainty for business, this long-standing swing back and forth in BC must be kind of stressful for business, is my imagination. If we had longer term thinking that can come from really evidence-based policy, focusing on outcomes, focusing on creating that certainty and predictability for business.
Do you have priorities, though, or deal breakers
priority,
that you're already thinking about?
The priority, and I said this yesterday, the priority really is about that overall framework of how government works and ensuring that we are measuring the outcomes. I've been saying this I went back and read some of my speeches earlier today. I've been saying the same things for so long in the legislature, but we keep hearing from governments, oh, we're investing $1 billion here, or we're putting $250 million there. And then we never really hear, okay, how did that work out? Now imagine running a business that way and saying, we're just gonna throw $100 million over here, but don't worry, we got you. Don't ask us how that turned out. You measure the outcomes in your businesses. Government needs to measure outcomes, not in the same way. Government is not, in my view, is not a business. Government is providing services and ensuring that the fabric of society is beneficial to people and to businesses. And so for me, it's really about, can we orient our government towards measuring whether or not the way they're spending money is actually getting the outcomes that they want to get. And to do that, you have to identify the outcomes you want and then start ensuring that you're measuring.
I'm pretty sure John and David were listening to that very closely. Sonia, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please.